All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Blake Hurst, President of Missouri Farm Bureau, and I want to welcome you to our virtual commodity conference. We're very disappointed that we were unable to have it in person, but we think we've got a great lineup of, we know we have a great lineup of speakers, of sessions. As you all know, you'll have to dial in on Zoom or conference call or however you're communicating with us for each session. So we have 8 separate sessions, and even the ones that run back to back, you'll have to hang up and redial. So each session stands on its own. We've got people participating on Zoom, on conference calls, on Facebook Live. We're also recording each session, and you'll be able to watch and listen to those when time allows. And that address, I hope all of you have received it. I know all of you have received an email, but if you haven't, or if you've misplaced the email, here is the address, MOFB.org//event/commodity. And so all 8 sessions will be taped and be available for your viewing pleasure when you have time. Some notes for our session. If you're watching on Zoom, you can ask anytime by pressing on the question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen and typing it in. We have Spencer Tuma is going to be looking at the questions, and after the speakers have finished in this first panel, we'll be getting those questions to the speakers. If you're calling in by telephone and have a question, please press *9 on your phone. Again, please press *9 on your phone. This will tell us, basically, we'll hold your hand up so that we know that you're interested and asking a question, and we will take those questions as they come in. And at that time, we'll unmute your line. If you do get a chance to ask a question, please, turn down your radio, turn down the Zoom call, and so that it doesn't interfere with your question. I'll introduce the speakers one by one. We have 3 panelists with us this morning. We're excited about this panel. We've really got some top-notch people to talk about pork and dairy markets, and excited about the opportunity. We have to hear them. Obviously, a controversial issue the last several months, and as things have settled a bit, we're still seeing huge margins between what you're paying in the store and what you're receiving for your fat cattle, your feeder calves. And in the next hour or so, we're going to find out why. Our first speaker is Dr. Lee Schultz. He's a livestock economist and associate professor at Iowa State University. He's works at the Department of Economics there and serves as the statewide extension specialist on livestock economics and markets. His integrated extension research and teaching program provides leadership in the study of and educational programming for critical problems facing the livestock and meat industry, including marketing, risk management, agriculture and trade policies, animal health, biosecurity, and management and regulatory issues. We're really pleased to have Dr. Schultz with us this morning. He spent a lot of time in the last few months both learning about and presenting about our livestock market situation. He's well known as a national expert on these topics, and I would like to welcome Dr. Schultz from Ames, Iowa.
Good morning, everyone. I'll share my screen here quickly. And I hope everyone can see that. So I'm going to start out with a cartoon slide here, and this is probably the best slide I'll have all morning. And so here we have an older gentleman with his grandson, and the older gentleman is saying, "We didn't hoard toilet paper back in my day. We would tear a page out of the phone book in a Sears catalog." And the grandson saying, "What's a phone book and what's a Sears catalog?" And for me, this really kind of highlights what the situation was as we went through these tremendous disruptions the last couple of months here. The older gentleman, I think that really speaks to the ingenuity of the industries. When I heard folks in the media talk about how not resilient the meat supply chain was, how fragile it was, that was completely wrong. We've seen tremendous pivots by producers to really mitigate some of the dire situation or outcomes that could have occurred. And then also, speaking to the grandson here, I think it is important to highlight that this was truly unprecedented. So we can't necessarily use historical data to really identify what was going to happen during this situation, as well as many of us didn't experience this. So I know there was similarities when a lot of people wanted to compare 1998 in the hog industry to the current situation. I, for one, have been in this job 8 years. And so that's something that I didn't experience that many of you may have. So I think a lot of this, we're all going into it blind. And so, a lot of it was some unexpected, some probably paradoxical relationships. But hopefully that's what I'm going to highlight a little bit today and speak a little bit to the economics of that. So here's a graph of futures for live cattle and lean hogs, and I think it really highlights some of these major disruptions we've seen. The big circle being the COVID-19 situation, and earlier in the fed cattle markets, that circle being the Holcomb fire this last fall. And when you look at futures prices, really 2020 is going to stand out, right? And so those are trading right now from a 105 average. If I take what's already experienced and then what we expect for the rest of the year, for cattle, for hogs, it's in that $55 per hundredweight. The optimism out there, at least in the futures market, is possible return to close to 2019 levels. And I think a lot of that is predicated on expectations and strong demand, both domestically on the export market, as well as really normalcy when we talk about the supply situation. Now, early on in that pandemic, and I'll give credit to my co-author here, Glenn Tonzer, he really felt and we put together a need for understanding what potentially could happen with increases in capacity utilization or decreases in total capacity. And when you look at historical relationships, this graph is for beef. We also do this for pork in this paper. We show that a 1% increase in utilization or a 1% decrease in capacity decreases cattle prices by 1.3%. So what does that mean at much bigger levels? Well, if you go all the way up to 40% decrease in capacity, that decreases prices by about 50%. So that kind of gives a benchmark here, and then I'll talk about what the data went through here in 2020. So as we look at slaughter, and how I measure capacity is pretty easily here, just measure it compared to 2019 levels, assuming those were normal levels for processing capacity. And what we see here is really the week ending April 11th was the first major reduction in processing capacity, and got all the way down for steers and heifers to 40% below year earlier levels. Barrows and gilts, it was about 36% below earlier levels. Now, importantly, this is aggregate US data, but that data point there I have for region 7, which includes Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska. That week ending May 2nd was the worst nationally, and it also was the worst when we looked at that region at 48% below year ago levels. Now, if we look at the period since early May to currently, barrow and gilt slaughter is down 1.24 million head, or that's 3%. Cattle slaughter is down 1.19 million and 13%. You'll see that cattle slaughter really for the first time since March got back up to year previous levels for this last week here, week ending August 1. So as we look at the reduction in processing capacity or slaughter, what did that mean for prices? And I purposely make this graph really messy. And the reason why is I'm using every cattle price here, and I could do a similar thing for hogs as well, but for brevity here, I'm just going to do cattle. We see the negotiated, the formula, forward contract net, and the negotiated grid, and then a total weighted average. These are Iowa prices. I have Iowa data readily available as I do many presentations here in Iowa. It would show a similar story nationally. When we look at that worst week in processing capacity, you'll see negotiated prices were 24% lower. So a 40% decline we've seen that week only led to a 24%. And I don't mean to underplay that 24%. But really the historical data suggested prices could have declined 50%. Now, when we look at the total weighted average, the decline was 17% because, as you'll see, forward contract prices really didn't start to decline until we got into mid-May, and then really all prices, declined since then. Currently, really all those prices are pretty close in the range of about that buck per pound for fed steers. Now, what does this all mean for profitability for feedlots? Well, 2020 is going to continue a string here the last several years of below break-even profits. This is a model here we estimated Iowa State to show profitability. It's a cash market model. So I'm using negotiated prices, and then I'm using prices, I'm buying hand to mouth for corn, for feeder cattle, distillers grains, and all those inputs. And that gives me my profitability here. You'll see that there's some profitability potential here when I use those futures prices to project out into 2020 and 2021. And at earliest in September here, 2020. The reason why is that September closeout matches up with an April placement of feeder cattle when we've seen very suppressed feeder cattle prices. But also we see potential for some above break-even returns to end the year, and then as well as we get into seasonally higher prices into the first and potentially second quarter of 2021. Now this next slide here shows what you could have hedged for 2020 closeouts. And so that's to your right of that blue straight line there. And so when I update this model monthly, I always take futures prices out, which effectively gives you that net hedge price and then a return on those closeouts. When I was doing this back in late December and early January, those returns for all of 2020, which were driven by a lot of the first half of those returns, would have averaged about $40 per head profit. And you'll see compared to historically going back to 2007, that would have been a pretty good year compared to some of the large losses we've seen in some of that historical data. Now, as prices have declined, you'll see that margins for 2020 got as low as $142 on an annual basis and now have improved to about $50 per head loss. Now, I don't show this as a teachable moment. I don't like that phrase. It assumes that something was done wrong. And I think markets early on in 2020 were optimistic. There was a lot of positive fodder on the trade front, and we could have seen much higher values. No one's seen the COVID pandemic coming, right? But I think it does show, and for me, it highlights the importance of education, of how, risk management, price risk management is not all about getting the highest price. It's protecting against those 142 losses or the $225 per head losses that we've seen in 2015. Now, what's probably got the most attention during this situation, or at least a lot of the questions that I fielded, is looking at the difference between fed cattle prices and box beef prices. And the next several slides, I'm going to highlight some of these relationships. I'm not attempting to speak to one side or the other here. I think what the importance, and I've tried to provide, is let's provide the best data, the best information to show this story, because I think these margins can be manipulated. I think sometimes by accident, maybe sometimes on purpose, when we see them quoted in some of the various sources that we read and look at. So here's what I'm showing is the negotiated choice box beef price and the 5-area negotiated steer price. This is the largest you can make this margin. So it doesn't assume all the other ways I sell cattle or all the other ways that packers sell beef to retail markets, be it formula, forward contract, and all those other various forms. So with these spreads here, you could look at that worst week or the largest spread in mid-May at $347 per hundredweight. If I multiply that by 8.5 carcass weight, that gets me about a $3,000 margin And I think a lot of times that's referenced as the Packers margin. And hopefully I convince you through the next several slides that these margins were historically large, but they weren't that large when you look at it from truly looking at the best representative data and then truly looking at net margins for Packers. Now, importantly, what's driving that boxed beef price is strong demand. And I think it's even stronger because of the stocking up behavior. The meat demand monitor out of Kansas State University, Glenn Tonzer, is responsible for this, this publication, and this research showed that consumers were stocking up, as we seen in the grocery stores, and the data really bears that out in March and April, and I think that continued into May. Now, I'm not going to go through this graph because I don't have a lot of time to do this, but the reason why we've seen lower cattle prices and higher meat prices is really the economics of it. So to summarize, when you see a reduction in 40% capacity or 20% or even 5%, when we've seen with that Holcomb fire, you get less demand from packers for cattle because there's less shackle space available. It's not that they don't want to buy those cattle if they're making money on the beef that they're selling. There's just no physical capacity for those cattle. Similar situation could be said for pork, for poultry, for whatever species we are talking about. So that gets a lower price for the livestock. Now, with a strong demand for beef, you have many retailers and food service that's still open. They're all vying for that reduced supply because we're processing less animals. So with that reduced supply, you get bidding up behavior that's reflected in retail prices, but also even more reflected in wholesale prices, and you get higher boxed beef prices, and you get a widening of that margin. Now, these Packer margin estimates are very sensitive to the data used. So I've already spoke to a little bit the boxed beef price. Do we use the choice boxed beef, or do we use a comprehensive to represent all the beef sold? The value of the byproducts is certainly important. Sometimes that makes a packer profitable or not. Now, in the situation of COVID, there was some packing plants that were reducing some of their fabrication or their saving of the byproducts, and so that was a value loss to those packers. And then the value of the animal. So do we use the negotiated price, or do we use a representative price of all the ways that cattle are sold? So that gives us our packer gross margin. That's what's typically reported a lot of times in the media. But then we also have operating costs that those packers are incurring, which could be wages, transportation, utilities. Those could be higher during disruptions. And then you have fixed costs as well, those facilities and equipment. So that gives you a packer net margin. So I think this is analogous. I like to think about it this way. So I showed you earlier the estimated returns to finishing yearling steers. And it showed that really since 2017, on an annual basis, we haven't really made much money looking at that Iowa State model. But if I would look at gross returns, that would suggest that it's a windfall for finishing cattle. And that those gross returns just being the fed cattle value minus the feeder cattle value. And so I think here's the major difference when we look at these packer margins and the importance of why do we need to look at the net margin. And if we show that net margins are still historically large, that's still a very important story. And I think that's even a more representative and impactful story when we talk about it. So what we did, this was a project with Jason Lusk out of Purdue, Glenn Tonzer out of Kansas State, and myself. We looked at the sensitivity of these marketing margins. So one, just looking at the packer gross margin, then two, looking at the packer approximated net margin, where we count for capacity utilization and the variable and fixed cost. And then we include some COVID costs. It's just an assumption here of a $20 increase in fixed costs and a $20 per head increase in variable costs. And then finally, that packer net margin, but let's look at all the different ways that cattle are bought by packers. So the summary here, it doesn't change the story, but it changes the estimates or the height of those packer margins. So a difference of about $700 to $800 per head when we look at that mid-May week, when we compare the gross margin to a net margin and a net margin that we control for COVID costs. Now, furthermore, you could look at all the different ways that cattle are bought by packers, and remember those forward contract prices were very strong in April, and that shows the difference here when you account for that in the green line to show those packer margins weren't as high. Again, the story doesn't change that we've seen historically high margins, but I think it's important to talk appropriately about what the data can and can't tell us. Now, when we look at the situation presented by COVID and the number of packing plants affected, you'll see that here highlighted by a map put together by the KC Fed, which showed several plants had positive COVID cases but were never closed, but there were several plants that were closed less than a week or even more than a week. And this all attributed to that reduction in slaughter capacity. So it wasn't just that plants closed, it was that plants severely decreased operations for a period of time. And really the situation wasn't necessarily driven by anything beyond the labor that they were facing. So we had a real labor constraint. If it wasn't the labor constraint, I think ingenuity would have prevailed. The industry had incentive, obviously, to increase operational rates, but when you had the labor supply impacted both directly and indirectly, you've seen those operational levels that we did. And I think why you've seen it in areas like Iowa was because of the importance of slaughters and meat packers. So for every 1,000 jobs in Iowa, over 3 are in the slaughters and meat packers industry. And when you look at Sioux City, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, that tri-state area there, for every 1,000 jobs, 15 are in the meat packers and slaughter. So whenever you have a shock to the labor in a particular area, like we did with COVID, that's why you've seen the large impact on packing plants. And there wasn't available labor to really draw from. So if you go back to March time period, or even a little bit before that, February, I like to use this statistic out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's the number of unemployed persons per job opening. There was less than 1 in February. So if I'm looking to hire someone, I can expect to get less than 1. This is what all employers were facing, and you could argue that meat packers, this was even lower number there. So again, when that labor supply was impacted, there wasn't a pool of laborers to draw from. Now, when we look at the structure of packing plants in the United States, and again, this is a similar story for pork. I show you cattle here. USDA breaks this down annually to show by size group, and you'll see that there's 480 federally inspected cattle plants, and that represents almost 72% of the plants. We have 670 total. Now, those very small plants slaughter less than 1% of the cattle annually. If you take the flip side of that, there's 12 plants nationally that slaughter over 1 million head per year. Now, they represent over 50% of the cattle slaughter. Now, this hasn't really changed since 1998. That large group, the over 1 million head slaughtered annually, that market share has only increased 0.6% from that time period. So the structure has remained relatively intact over that period. It speaks a lot to the economies of size, but also I think the importance of the distribution of those size groups. I've said it many times, every size packer has a role in this industry. It was shown before this, and it was certainly shown during COVID-19. A lot's talked about the economies of scale, but I think we need to really highlight the abilities of scale in this in what we experienced over the last couple of months. So normal processing capacity for cattle is about 125,000 head per day. It's maybe about 127,000, but I make my math easy here. So if you lose 40% capacity, that means 50,000 cattle are backed up on the farm that day. Now, if you do that for 5 days, that's 250,000 head are backed up in a week. And so if you had a small-ish plant that could take 100 head of cattle per day, so there's 28 of those in the US right now, they would need to run 50 extra days just to make up for one plant that can slaughter 5,000 head per day. Or you would need 50 brand new smallish plants to be able to do that 5,000 head plant that does it in one particular day. Now, can we do that with the available infrastructure we have? So USDA reports monthly non-federally inspected slaughter. And we see here in June that those slaughter numbers did ramp up, but they only account for hogs less than 1% of commercial slaughter and cattle about 2% of commercial slaughter. So many of the constraints that large facilities, federally inspected facilities face as far as labor, as far as equipment, as far as just facility size, you can think about cold storage, are even more drastic in some of these smaller plants that are out there. Now, certainly every bit helped during this pandemic, and for individual operations, these non-federally inspected slaughters were really key to keeping many of those operations current or have some semblance of currency. Now, on-farm slaughter, this data is available through 2019. Again, this is really a drop in the bucket, less than 1% for both hogs and cattle. So here's my last slide, and I highlight an article here with Glenn Towns or myself that appeared looking at the economic impacts of COVID on the food and agricultural markets. We focused in on the meat processing sector, and I'll highlight here again, truly historic disruptions here. It wasn't just an isolated case. It wasn't just the United States. This was worldwide, where many major protein markets worldwide were impacted by this, both from a supply and a demand standpoint. We certainly, I think the vulnerability was really related to labor and not necessarily the supply chain. I heard a lot of talk about the just-in-time supply chain for hogs. I think that got way overplayed when you've seen the ability and desire and just effectiveness of producers adjusting diets, sorting, topping off pens, increasing stocking densities, finding additional facility space. That was really all remarkable. And I think that really points to the resiliency of the supply chains. There's been a lot of calls for change. I think some of them are speculative at this point. We're very much early on in this recovery process, but talk about automation at packing plants, added cold storage, number, size, and design of facilities. I would caution really the calculus involved in making these changes is very complicated. The saying is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I think the industry has developed over a long period of time to the way it is. And I think we need to appreciate some of those developments. Now, can we make some adjustments? Can it become more flexible? Certainly. But I think we need to really strike a careful balance between efficiency in normal times, which we've really seen historically with a few disruptions, and resiliency during pandemics and other disruptions that we potentially could see.
All right, thank you much, Dr. Schultz. And we'll turn, our next presenter is Dr. Scott Brown. No stranger to those of us in Missouri. We appreciate him showing off our columns at back of Jesse Hall there. He's the Director of Strategic Partnerships for CAFNR. He's Associate Extension Professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences as the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the College of Agriculture, Food and Natural Resources. He's worked with U.S. Congress over the past 3 decades, testified dozens of times in determining the quantitative effects of changes in dairy and livestock policies, and he's testified regarding, of course, dairy and livestock policy issues many times. He works with the Missouri legislature on those issues as well, and is the advisor for our Collegiate Farm Bureau chapter, and a very good friend of all of us here at Missouri Farm Bureau. Scott, welcome this morning.
Blake, thank you very much. It's good to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about cattle pricing issues. I start this morning by just reminding you this is not new. I was reminding myself of my first time on the University of Missouri campus, and I got to listen to a Harold Breimeyer seminar series. For those that have some history with the University of Missouri, you'll remember Harold Breimeyer. Back in 1986, they talked about the future of the Missouri livestock industry. Jim Rhodes was one of the speakers, and I looked at a summary where he says, the structure of packing has been changing fairly rapidly as a result of the entry of new firms that exploited new technology, greater economies of scale, and the advantages of lower labor costs. As a result of larger and fewer plants and firms, producers face fewer alternatives in selling their livestock. He goes on to say, I regard packer competition as generally quite workable, but the recent trends towards greater concentration should worry us a bit. I thought that was an interesting observation for 1986. I'm curious what Dr. Rhodes would say today about the structure that we have. And so it's certainly not a new issue. I keep saying I think it's one that we'll get to talk about for a long time. I wanted to make sure of a few things just right out of the gate this morning. So I always like to talk about more negotiated trade probably provides better price discovery. I remind us that that's not always higher prices. More negotiated trade at times could drive prices lower, but price discovery is certainly, I think, the issue we need to think about as we see concentration that's really continued over decades. As you have fewer buyers and sellers, you certainly increase the chance for some non-competitive market behavior. And I think there's a reason why we see a lot of interest today in whether or not we need to make changes. I agreed a lot with where Lee was with us this morning as well, just to remind us that there are large economies of scale, and frankly, they're in all segments of the cattle industry, not just the packer side. And those economies of scale reduce costs along the way. And so there's always this trade-off of reducing cost as we get bigger to take advantage of economies of size that has to be weighed against the concentration that comes on the other side. So there's no simple answers here, I think, is one of the things that I like to remind us. And just as we think about how prices at different market levels for cattle moved, COVID-19 was an unbelievable shock to the system. And I think, as Lee said as well, it's just amazing how well these markets worked. I think we can still, however, go back and talk about who bears the risk in these kind of events, and is that risk shared correctly? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that question either, but one we should pay attention to. So just a little bit of background, and maybe I'm going to have gone down the wrong road for some of you today, but I just want to provide some data that I think makes me at least ask more questions. If you think about 5 and 6 weight steer calf prices, we've actually recovered nicely through much of July after what was a pretty tough March, April period for prices. We really started the year at about $1.70. on those calf prices. And as Lee pointed out, there was a lot of optimism about what was going to happen on the export side of the equation that I think drove us to some optimistic possibilities for 2020. But we've gotten back to $1.60 or so when we look at those prices. So I think things have been helpful. I guess for me, the good news is we didn't market that many calves in the period of the worst of the price declines. Now, I will say to this price graph, I'm not sure what happens between here and the end of 2020. I certainly worry about some of the demand side, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when you look at cattle on feed numbers that we got back, yes, in April and May, we lost 500,000-600,000 head of on feed inventory as everything slowed down with the effects of COVID-19. As you look at what happened in June and July, we certainly recovered quite nicely back to levels of on feed inventory that we would have had in 2019. And so it starts to show this idea that we certainly pushed cattle back in terms of trying to slow down what was going on. Feedlot placements as well. We didn't place a lot of cattle in March and April, which, by the way, I'll remind us when we look at 2021 data, we'll have to remember just how curtailed 2020 was. But as we look at May and June numbers that we got, we were right back at 2019 levels. So again, resiliency throughout the system. I will say COVID-19 remains a key issue. I sure hope we get a vaccine sometime soon, but I think even then it will take months to talk about any kind of normal events. A lot of uncertainties about those new cases moving forward. I remind us now that for me, the demand side is important for two reasons. Number one, we can talk about short-term stimulus and dollars that are available. We're certainly seeing Congress debate another round of stimulus right now. But if you take that stimulus away, what's that mean for consumer spending? And just the sheer reduction in the economy that I think could be a drag on the demand side for us. I have a series of quick graphs here just to remind us, and for those that can see the graphs, you'll see the gold line. I tried to kind of line up the end of March in all of these just to remind us how severe a time it was. So this first graph, supermarket foot traffic, the blue line being the 2020 data, you see, according to this data, that we're really in mid-March talking about a 10 to 15% percentage point decline relative to where we were in 2019. For me, that was kind of the early part of COVID-19, but then all of a sudden when we shut down, you see the spike in this graph where we went from 85, a 0.85 to a 1.2 increase, and just the slug of demand that happened at the grocery store side as folks wanted to stock up. I just remind you that after that, you look at the foot traffic data that's available, it has slowed down some, but supermarket traffic in general has been fairly strong. You compare that to what was foot traffic at sit-down restaurants, and by the end of March, we started mid-March at what was about a 1 in terms of the index of relative foot traffic that fell to a 0.4. Don't see that kind of move in normal circumstances. So a basically shut down situation certainly wreaked havoc with what was happening in meat markets. We've gotten some nice recovery. I do worry a little bit with what's been happening of late, that as cases have gone up, we've slowed down. As Lee pointed to, when you look at slaughter that was happening roughly around the same time, this is where we were getting a lot of plant shutdowns. So what was 105 to 115,000 average daily rate of cattle slaughter fell to 75,000. That kind of shutdown certainly hurt us on the cattle price side. So all of those factors going on at the same time, I kind of start to close on that point by just reminding us of, when we started 2020, first quarter beef production was almost 8% above year ago levels. And for the second quarter of 2020, it fell to about 11% below year ago levels. We don't see those kinds of changes very often in terms of the meat sector more generally. So box beef prices, Lee's already talked about this, got very high. Again, I go combinations of strong demand pull as supermarkets, we're seeing consumers stock up, coupled with the worst of the shutdowns or slowdowns in cattle processing plants. It's not surprising that we see that kind of spike in hindsight, but again, we'll have a lot of discussion about the relative price levels that we see at each point along the way. I want to close this section by just reminding us this is more than just a cattle issue in terms of how COVID-19's affected us, and a little bit of concern on my point. If you look at the graph off the left-hand side, it's the annual percentage change in prices received by farmers, so all commodities. If you notice, for those that can see the graph here, we're talking about being down 5 to 10% as we started the worst of the COVID. Yet off the right-hand side, the CPI for food, so overall consumer price index for food, up about 4%. This idea that we've in some ways come unhooked from farm to retail. The graph also shows us that we tend to see a very good correlation between consumer prices and farm prices, but that just really got moved apart as we talked about the worst of COVID. I worry about income, so here's a graph of projections of real GDP. It looks like most now are suggesting it will take us until 2022 to get back to the 2019 real level of GDP. That drag is something that we'll have to face for a while. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, not all cattle and calves are the same. Different health, different genetics, uniformity. A little bit more about demand for feeder cattle is, we're a strong feeder cattle state here in Missouri. And just a little bit of maybe a different points for us to think about. So Joplin feeder cattle price ranges, all right? So I was a little bit, I guess, not doing all my homework, but from the first week of November, that's what you have plotted on this graph. It's the high to low values paid for 4 and 5 weight calves and 5 and 6 weight calves at Joplin. So why am I showing you this graph? I want to remind you that generally those ranges have widened over time. Now, for those that can see the graph, you look at a year like 2014 and we were short on calves. I think really good calves brought up a pretty strong premium, and you see that in the graph. But generally, we've seen a widening of the range over time, and I would argue that has a lot to do with calves that are better quality, and I'm not saying that just from a meat quality perspective, but healthier, grow more efficiently. Maybe it's better genetics. Those cattle or calves are worth more, and so we're seeing a bigger range from top to bottom. Now, I know everyone on this call has the best quality calves possible, so if we probably did this for the folks on this call, it wouldn't show this big spread, but there are some folks that have below average calves. How do we make sure we're getting that message back to our producers of what's demanded in terms of cattle? I go one further, and I think, as Lee said, I sometimes say as economists, we always have graphs that are too complicated so no one can understand them. So I added one in for my talk this morning. It's really meant to talk about demand for feeder cattle. We oftentimes talk about demand for beef and whether it's strong or whether it's weak, but we can sometimes look at demand for feeder cattle in a similar way. So for those that can see the graph along the horizontal axis, it's kind of the added value provided to feeder cattle prices relative to the gross value of fed cattle less their feed costs. On the vertical axis, it looks at the percentage change in placements. We tried to lag this to try to give us a little bit of sense of what's going on. So in a year like 2013, where we have a pretty strong premium for feeder cattle, you know, that had a lot to do with just how tight supplies were. For me, when I look at the points on this graph of 2015, 2018, even 2016, very strong demand for calves. I go 2015, you had feed yards who were certainly bidding pretty strongly, trying to get some feed yards closer to capacity that drove demand fairly strong. So we come out of a period where we had pretty strong demand for feeder cattle, and I think some of that's been waning as we were growing the industry. We all were really good about adding more cows in a period of good profitability, and I think that's been at play in terms of price levels as well. And maybe a little different than most would think about. So University of Missouri's Thompson Research Center, about a 200 head, primarily Angus-based cow herd up in Spickard, Missouri. I'm showing some of the individual steer carcass data. So we feed those steers, traditionally have been fed in western Kansas. We retain ownership. They've primarily over this period been sold on the USPB grid. And so I did what's the value of those individual steers relative to a US average, if you will. And for those that can see the graph, you know, you get a range of anywhere from about a 0.7 to 1.3 on average. Those Thompson steers were better than a US average. You'll notice some outliers that are low. I go, generally, we'd probably look at steers that got sick somewhere along the way. Something happened to them that ended up being low performers. I just remind us that Thompson herd is extremely consistent. If you look at the cows there, they look pretty identical. So not a lot of variability, yet when you look at how those steers fed, there is a lot of variability. So how do we make sure that we're driving value to those highest quality steers? It's important to the mix. So for those that aren't so familiar with that Thompson farm, I sometimes say, you know, that at times they're going to talk about more than half of those steers that would grade prime. So some pretty good premiums over the period, but it just reminds me of just how variable revenue to steers can be over the period, and using that individual data, I think, is interesting to try to figure out cattle pricing. All right, so you know, what can we do about some of this? And I wanted to get to the local side. I know that Lee talked about it as well. So I have a master's student who's currently doing a little bit of survey work that is focused at consumers. Like ultimately, what do consumers want out of this? Some of the questions being asked of, you know, helps us understand what's the value of Missouri grown label on that? What's the value of locally grown label? What's a USDA prime label look like in terms of value? So I think helping us, if we were to look at the local processing option, how do we make sure that we're driving strong demand for those products? We know there are economies of size in processing, so a smaller plant likely has that as a disadvantage, but can it create a product that has stronger demand and can drive some type of premium? So we're in the process of that, hope to get that done by the end of the year, but I always will remind us that making sure that we hit what consumers want is an important piece of that. So I kind of close by just, again, reminding us that it is a balancing act between economies of scale and concentration and the potential for non-competitive behavior. I don't think we're going to fix this problem in a matter of months. I think how to best price cattle will remain an issue for, and I say many years to come, and my bullet point, I might say for decades as we look forward. So again, Blake, I appreciate the chance to visit this morning, and I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Scott. We appreciate your comments. Kelly Smith put this panel together, and as you can see, we're 2/3 of the way through, and he's done a great job. He pointed out to me, Scott, that most of those below average cattle in Joplin are from Kansas.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
Kansas,
yeah.
Oklahoma, Arkansas,
Yeah.
somewhere, that's for sure.
All right, our final panelist this morning is Scott Bennett, and he's the Director of Congressional Relations for the American Farm Bureau Federation. His issue portfolio is comprised of livestock and related issues, including gypsum, cell-based plant proteins, gene editing, and mandatory price reporting. And before he started working with AFBF, he was legislative director for the former House Chair of the Ag Committee, Bob Goodlatte from Virginia, and obviously was very active during the writing of the 2018 Farm Bill. Scott, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Hopefully I'm loud and clear. I think it's perfect that I was switched to now be third presenting behind Dr. Brown and Dr. Schultz, because I think they set me up perfectly to discuss kind of some policies here in Washington that have been a direct result of the consternation and these volatile markets that they did such a phenomenal job of outlining for us. When we look back at volatility in the cattle markets in particular, first comes to mind was Holcomb. Back in August of 2019, we had the Holcomb, the Tyson Holcomb beef plant went down. That plant alone consisted of 5 to 6% of the weekly slaughter capacity in the United States. At the time, we thought the world was coming to an end on the beef cattle market side of things. It was such a shift, and we saw box beef cutout spike and things of that nature. What we did not know was that a mere 6 months from then, COVID-19 was going to happen, and COVID-19 volatility was going to make Holcomb really almost look insignificant. But I think we've learned a lot of lessons from both of those events, and certainly not only have farmers and ranchers in the countryside learned from the volatility and the need for risk management. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and we saw a lot of interest enter the political atmosphere as far as what can Congress do, what can my legislators do to try and tame this beast when we saw volatility. And I really separate things kind of into two camps when we look at the volatility, especially from COVID-19. We had one issue over here that was primarily that of the volatile cattle markets. We saw prices at the grocery store go up. Folks weren't necessarily receiving that at home. Packing capacity was down. There was a lot of focus on the big four, right? The four major packers that have ownership of 80 to 85% of the weekly slaughter capacity. Is bidding of cattle competitive at all times, especially in a pandemic? Folks were really concerned about how cattle were priced and the volatility in the markets. So you saw interest from legislators on policies, primarily and the main one being 5014 from Senator Grassley of Iowa. So, and what that bill would require each individual packing plant to derive at least 50% of their cattle to be killed within 14 days from negotiated cash. For many parts of the country, we see negotiated cash trade anywhere from 8 to 15, 20%, and in some places, such as Iowa, much more closer to 50%. And then the second camp of folks or the second camp of concerns was that of packing capacity, right? You go to the grocery store, there's no meat, or what's there is full retail price. There were no specials. And yet you go home and there's, your cattle, you're not feeling that coming back to you. There was a lot, again, when you look at the consolidation of the packing industry, there was a resurgence of interest in these very small, medium-sized packing plants becoming more robust and playing more of a role in our supply chain of beef. So when I look at things in those two camps, we'll focus primarily on that of the packing capacity. And some of the bills that have come out of Congress that are being discussed right now to really address that issue. American Farm Bureau has been very active in that in the discussions over these bills, and I'll give a quick review of a handful of them and how we perceive them to be beneficial to the industry. The first one, and honestly the most recent bill, is a bill that comes from Colin Peterson, a chair of the House Ag Committee, and it is called the Ramp Up Act. What it would do would provide $100,000, up to $100,000 grants to small and very small packing facilities, and those are legal terms that dictate the size of a packing plant. It would provide up to $100,000 grant for those plants to become federally inspected, FSIS inspected. Of course, just a really quick rundown, you have your custom kill facilities, right, where you can take an animal, it's processed, you get the beef back, and of course, on the beef, it says not for retail sale. We have 27 states that have state-inspected meat programs. That meat cannot be sold across state lines. It can be sold within the state. And then you have FSIS inspection, which is your federally inspected meat processing. That beef, that meat can be sold across state lines, and certainly is what you see mostly commercially sold. So the Ramp Up Act would allow some of these smaller plants to now become FSIS inspected. And the idea was that at that point in time, especially during COVID, where that packing capacity was down, as Dr. Brown's mentioned, even 60% capacity, folks were sick in these plants. They had to shut them down. They had to disinfect and clean them. Would allowing some of these smaller packing facilities coming on board, would that possibly facilitate more meat on the shelf at the grocery store in a time where when we focus on this just-in-time meat supply, when a large packing facility goes down, that creates a significant impact in that immediate area of what beef potentially could be available at the grocery store. I believe Dr. Schultz mentioned in his presentation that, it would take so many of these small and very small packing plants to make up the difference that you see when one of these large plants goes down in one fell swoop. I think he's correct there, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the public interest to maybe make or integrate these small and very small packing plants, play more of a role in our nation's meat supply. The second bill, one that comes from a freshman congressman out of South Dakota, Dusty Johnson, it is called the Direct Act. And what it would do is allow direct-to-consumer sale from the farm to the consumer of state-inspected meat across state lines. So as it stands currently, you cannot sell state-inspected meat across state lines. There's a couple of exceptions, mainly CIS. We won't get into those details, but generally speaking, state-inspected meat cannot be sold across state lines. And the primary reason for that is the ability to recall. So if I were to sell Virginia-inspected beef into a neighboring state like West Virginia and it needed to be recalled, since it's not federally inspected, the Virginia State Department of Health doesn't necessarily have the authority to go across state lines and recall that meat. FSIS inspection, federal inspection, they preempt the state. So of course, they have the authority to cross state lines and recall that meat. There's also some trade implications as well with state inspection and the need for FSIS inspection for trade purposes as well. But this Direct Act, it would allow for that sale direct from the producer to the consumer across state lines. And the reason for that, and this bill has FSIS blessing. They do believe that the way this bill was written, that it would allow for, the ability to recall that meat wouldn't necessarily be like it was a generic product at the grocery store. The consumer would know exactly where they purchased that beef from. And again, it would provide an outlet that doesn't exist currently for some of these, not only for the producers to move their product, granted, not at any large scale, but, and then again, if you're a consumer, and especially in the throes of COVID, fortunately, we don't experience them anymore, but in the throes of COVID, when you couldn't go to the grocery store and get any protein, or at least protein that you wanted, this would have provided an outlet for you to have that. Of course, these bills are not law, and they are being discussed currently within the halls of Congress. We are supportive of these two bills. Another bill that we are supportive of is the small packer overtime relief bill. On the Senate side, it was introduced by Senator Moran of Kansas. And what this bill would do would simply reimburse the plants for the overtime pay of the FSIS inspector. So as you can imagine, FSIS inspectors are not employees of the plant, but rather employees of the Food Safety Inspection Service. They're required to be in these plants in order for the plants to process beef or meat that is federally inspected. Now, of course, if you, in your packing plant, decide to run overtime, you have to pay overtime to that FSIS inspector. If you're a big packing plant, you have these economies of scale. You're spreading that additional overtime pay over many animals. And of course, that affects the profit margin per animal to be minimal. But if you're a small packing facility, and we're talking about a plant that might slaughter 5 to 20 head of cattle a day, you cut your FSIS inspector off at 40 hours a week, because that additional cost, which is around $80 an hour, say you get another animal processed by having an FSIS inspector in there another hour, you're looking at $80, just tagged on that one carcass. And oftentimes that really will affect the bottom line of profitability there. So this bill, it's very simple, would allow for, it would allow the government to reimburse these small facilities for the overtime pay. So if these smaller plants that are FSIS inspected, they would now not have that at least additional burden to run a Saturday or Sunday shift, or maybe a third shift if it's a 1 or 2 shift plant. So that we saw as the ability to be very flexible. We are working these bills. They are very much a priority of American Farm Bureau right now, as we negotiate with the Senate and with the House on these next phase bills. I'll give a brief update from Washington, which unfortunately is brief because there's not much news to give. But as you all may well know, the CARES Act was passed. That is what we have called all along Phase 3, and that gave USDA $24 billion. I'm sure many producers out there have seen, the ability to go in and tap into some of those funds for any of your row crops or your livestock. Soon after the president signed the CARES Act, which was our phase 3, we saw the House side move their phase 4 package, which was dubbed the HEROES Act. There were some provisions in the HEROES Act that we really liked on the livestock side, one being a livestock dealer trust. It would establish a livestock dealer trust, which was a requirement that was inserted in the 2018 Farm Bill. We're advocating that the Senate, in the package that they have not yet completely put together or materialized, we're encouraging them to include that in the bill so that when or if the president signs a consensus bill that will be known as phase 4, it will include that provision. But as you well know, we're seeing negotiations each and every day, not only between the Senate and the House, the Senate, of course, being under Republican majority and the House being under Democrat majority, but then that of the White House, which they have their own initiatives and priorities that they hope to see in this bill. Of course, the president has to sign the bill, so it's important that his needs and wants are somewhat articulated in the debate that happens between the Senate and the House. I know that this afternoon at 5 o'clock Eastern, all the main folks, Pelosi, Schumer, Mitch McConnell, and Meadows, the chief of staff for President Trump, are going to be meeting this afternoon at 5 o'clock to try and make some movement on this phase 4 package. The Senate did release an initial bill there, and Leader McConnell kind of dubs it as a shell bill. But as far as agriculture, it has $20 billion allocated to USDA for COVID-related relief. This would be in addition to the monies that we saw in the CARES Act. And again, next month, we will also see an additional $14 billion in CCC replenishment dollars. So if we pretend that this $20 billion stays in the bill and makes it to the president's desk when he signs it, from start to finish, from phase 3 and phase 4, we will have come to a total of $50 billion in allocated funds for agriculture due to COVID-19 related losses. We are still working closely with all of the policymakers that are in the room negotiating this. We see the $20 billion as a positive move, a positive measure. We know that there are some aspects of agriculture that have seen damages well beyond what was provided in CARES, and so we believe that additional funding is needed. We have been told that agriculture is not at the very top or is much of a pawn in the chess game between the House and the Senate, that we could lose it. So I think from our perspective now, we're kind of keeping our heads down, let the principals in the House and Senate negotiate this bill, and then it will be sent to the White House hopefully very soon. I do not believe we'll see it this week. Of course, Congress takes a recess every August. The Senate they were scheduled to be in this week. The House was scheduled to begin their recess. Of course, all parties are still here in Washington, and they are debating and trying to come to a consensus on this bill. Hopefully, we'll see a vote very soon. I know that the president has threatened some executive actions if he doesn't see anything from Congress in the near term, but certainly we'll be working closely with all parties involved, and we'll update folks as we see additional movements. But with that, I won't take up any further time, and I look forward to any questions, and certainly thank you, President Hurst, for the opportunity to visit today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate your hat collection. We'll make sure that you get a Missouri Farm Bureau hat the next time we're in Washington. All right, we've got some time for questions. There are several ways you can ask a question. If you're watching on Zoom, just type it into the pressing the question answer tab on the bottom of your screen and typing it in, and I'll read the question. If you're calling in by telephone, again, hit *9 on your phone, and then Spencer will unmute you, and we'll get to you in rotation, and we'll unmute you so you can ask the question. If you do that, please tell us your name and your county so we know where you're calling from. And if you're following on Facebook, you could send your question in. When we experimented yesterday, Facebook's about 30 seconds behind Zoom, so it may take us a second to get to you, but we will do that. We do have a question from Geraldine Glow, and she wants to know, now that grocery stores, and I'll address this to any of the three of you, now that grocery store supply is once again closer to normal, a lot of the small processors are seeing cancellations. This may become an issue that need to be addressed in the future. Any comments about what's happening with small processors?
Well, so I haven't heard any cancellations. I think we, on the other side of that, I was hearing of stories of small processors being booked out into 2021, and not just the first few months of 2021, and you're realizing it's into, summer of 2021. I think it's really, I think it's important to understand, the ability of those packers matched up with the needs of consumers, right? And so I think, I 100% agree with Scott that, there is a role for each size packer out there, but understand they have a lot of limitations. And so, I think, understanding, was that a realistic situation to see their bookings out to 2021? I think that could have caused really some logistical challenges. A lot of times those smaller packers, or the volume there in Iowa, I could speak to, a lot of times hogs, because they don't need the necessary time hanging that cattle do. And really that could clog up that supply chain and impact consumers that did have some of their booking needs. So, I fully expect those packers, even though we've seen cancellations, to still be fully employed, just because I think a lot of consumers got used to and seen the value in freezer beef or freezer pork or whatever it is. And so, I think it really opened our eyes to many of the ways that we can buy locally and that should increase that demand.
All right, thank you. Any other comments from the panel, Scott? One or two?
I'll be short, just to remind us that I hope those smaller processors think hard about how to generate long-term demand. We're going to quickly figure out which consumers were purely in this for price, and how quickly they switch back to traditional ways. And so I always view the marketing side as really important. I just hope we keep our local processors from getting themselves financially at risk, as maybe they no longer process deer because they feel like they're so busy in some of these other commodities. We sure want them long-term, and hitting that demand side and marketing to consumers about things beyond price, I think, is important.
All right, thank you, Scott. I had a question. I'm going to address this to Scott Bennett first, and obviously the two doctors can pitch in. The NCBA had their national meeting last week. They came out with some policy proposals, or what policy proposals came out of that discussion, and I'll go to Scott Bennett first.
Thank you. So yes, you're correct. NCBA held their summer policy conference last week. I know they addressed the minimum negotiated trade issue at length. I have not discussed this at any great length with anyone at NCBA quite yet, but what I will mention is at NCBA, they did task themselves with putting together a working group to look at things, concerns within these cattle markets. However, at American Farm Bureau, we've had a cattle market working group established for several months now, and this working group has met with employees of FSIS to talk about the small and very small packing concerns. We visited with House and Senate Ag Committee staff, many economists from across the country, as some other trade associations inside Washington that may have a view of sometimes and oftentimes different than ours. We want to hear all sides. So we are analyzing this volatility internally at American Farm Bureau and hope that that will allow us to be more robust in policy development moving forward.
All right, any comments about the NCBA from Dr. Schultz or Brown? All right, good enough. I'll open this up, I think, to all three of you. The Grassley bill obviously is a big topic of conversation. So what concerns, if any, do you have both from AFBF's perspective and then perhaps from a couple of economists' perspectives about the Grassley bill? Don't all jump at once. Dr. Schultz, would you like to respond first, and then we'll go from there?
Sure. I think there's a few key points here to realize that, the structure of the industry, there's not a silver bullet here. And Scott Brown hit on it that, I think that the discussion is important to really focus in on price discovery and not necessarily, what's going to lead to higher prices. And I think we really need to separate those two. There's a lot of ways to increase price discovery as well. One is looking at, and I was involved with a study that looks at possible realignment. So there's a lot of states in particular, Colorado and at times Texas, that we're not receiving the negotiated prices because they're not meeting confidentiality. And a lot of times that confidentiality relates to the number of packing plants that are reporting, not necessarily the number of producers that are negotiating. And so if we were to revisit the alignment of those reporting, so putting states together, including additional states, that may ease some of those confidentiality restrictions and allow more reporting of that. Now, you could argue that that's potentially a Band-Aid approach because we've been on a downward trend of reduction in negotiated trade. But that possibly could be paired with more voluntary approaches to trade that could increase that number of negotiated. And realizing that here in the North, for the year in 2020, we've been trading 60% negotiated here in Iowa. And we're the highest really in the country of reporting. That's not necessarily the case in a lot of the other 5 market reporting areas. So any policy is not going to be inclusive of all individual states or even producers' needs necessarily.
Dr. Brown?
I'll just jump in and again agree with Lee, but provide maybe a little different. So if you think about a 50-14 becoming law, and all of a sudden I'm sitting there as a packer and I'm not going to meet the 50, how do I get there? What's my strategy? So I want to learn more about that process. I sometimes worry one way to do it is to go to those that have cattle priced some other way than negotiated and say, sorry, I'm not taking your cattle this week because I got to get to 50% negotiated. If you think about some of our higher quality cattle, that they're often going to be grid-based or formula-based, does that somehow create a disadvantage for some of our cattle producers relative to the added price discovery benefits of more negotiated? So it's not a simple solution here, I guess, is my point. And sometimes we're going to get potentially effects happening that we didn't anticipate. So I think we want to march carefully as we think about legislating a solution to this cattle pricing issue.
Sure. You can kind of tell that Senator Grassley's from Iowa, not from Missouri. All right, Scott Bennett, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I'll touch really briefly on that, and I think Dr. Schultz and Dr. Brown they have doctor in front of their name, so the economic merits of what this would do, I defer to them. But from a policy perspective, and I will be upfront, American Farm Bureau does not support a minimum negotiated trade or a mandatory minimum negotiated trade, simply because in our policy book, we've established that would take away from producers' ability to enter into AMAs. Alternative marketing arrangements, and could potentially take away their ability to add value to their cattle. If anyone has any questions about that from an American Farm Bureau standpoint, an economist on our team and myself put together a 3-page paper that briefly explains not only the economics of it, but the policy. But really briefly, I'll mention there's a reason that the 5014 discussion is ripe right now. Obviously, the volatility from COVID-19, but we are 50 some odd days now away from the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, 2020. And that is when the 5-year mandatory price reporting reauthorization will expire. So we are now needing to reauthorize mandatory price reporting after having just experienced one of the most volatile cattle market, in the history of my lifetime. And not only that, I'll throw this out there as food for thought. USDA had done their investigation of the marketplace, and they have published that. You can read through the analysis of what happened in the markets, but I think most importantly is at the end of that document, USDA actually outlines some what they call other considerations, and they are hints at potential policy that industry should take a look at to maybe address and not have the magnitude of volatility that we've seen in the past. But that's what I'll say. But with mandatory price reporting encroaching us each and every day, it just only makes this issue that much more important.
All right, thank you. We've got a question from Stan Code, a producer in Southern Missouri. The frustration of most producers and the desire to see something done with the packers is that profits made by the packers are not being passed on to the cattle feeders, and in turn the feeder calf producer. Is there anything that can be done to address this? Scott, I'm gonna let you go. Scott Brown, I'm gonna let you go first. Ask you to go first.
I knew when you said Scott, I could defer to Scott Bennett, but so it's a good question. That's number one, and one that we should be thinking about. I'm not sure that there's, again, an easy answer to that question. I sometimes, however, will say I'm not sure what we saw as large profits to beef packers. Maybe not quite as big as some of the ways we've looked at them. For me, this has a lot more to do with who's bearing the risk under these kind of COVID-19 outcomes that we have. And I sometimes worry that risk has gotten passed all the way to producers, and in the case of cow-calf producers. And I worry that we need to come up with a strategy to manage that risk better across all segments and not make that all get passed back ultimately to farmers. How you do that, I wish I had a good answer to Stan's question. I don't. I always worry a legislative solution has unintended consequences at times that make that a difficult road as well.
Dr. Schultz?
A few comments. I think, and we've seen other industries do this, right? And so being here in Iowa, it's hogs, right? And so there's more vertical integration. So there, yes, you are sharing more of the risk, but also possibly more of the profit, as we've seen producers get into strategic alliances or even ownership of packing plants. Now, there's consequences of that for the cattle industry if that is something moved to. Also, if we look at the hog industry, many of those formulas include a share of the pork cutout, right? And that formula changes over time, and how much of the cutout and how much is cut out versus a negotiated price. But there you are sharing much more of the pork price in some of the pricing for those animals. You can really point to this last May as an example. We've seen rather strong prices for hogs in May compared to earlier in April and later in June. And that was a lot pointed towards the strong cutout price. Now, an implication for the cattle industry, we don't see a pricing off of the box beef price. And one of the reasons is because of the live cattle contract. It isn't a cash settled contract like we do see with hogs in the lean contract. So there's implications for changing that, which has consequences for risk management when we talk about convergence of that live cattle contract. So it's not a simple answer here. There's a lot of factors, and if you move one thing, you're going to move another thing. And so there, again, I think we need to look at this lens also from a much broader view. So if we're just looking at 2020, the share of profits, as Scott Brown showed in retail prices and wholesale prices compared to farm level prices, has diverged. But the real key question is, does that persist, or do we return to more long-term historical relationships where we're both sharing risk and reward or profits in that case?
Scott Bennett, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question that, at least from a policy perspective, we've been trying to answer since COVID-19 started. That being said, and I think Dr. Schultz and Dr. Brown hit it right on the head. You pull one lever and the other one goes up. That's the unintended consequences. So I think from a policy perspective, we're trying to thread the needle and do as much as we can without creating these unintended consequences that, as Dr. Schultz mentioned, may benefit us now, but years down the road could really impede our ability to operate in a free market and add that additional value to the cattle that we certainly work so hard to raise.
Well, it's noon. That's the end of our session. I'd like to thank all three panelists. A tremendous job of covering our recent past and perhaps looking a little bit into the future as best we can. Again, thank you for joining us, those of you on Zoom, Facebook, or who have called in, and we'll see you again at 1 p.m. And again, you'll just have to dial in for the next session, and we will learn a little bit about carbon trading. So Scott Bennett, you may want to turn in, you'll probably learn something. So again, I want to thank Dr. Schultz, Dr. Brown, and Scott Bennett for their time and their wisdom and their experience, and thank all of you for listening. Goodbye for now.